As expected, the Federal Reserve cut interest rates today. This is the third rate cut of this cycle. We're now down to 1.5%. But of course, what everybody has to remember is a year ago, when the Fed was hiking interest rates, the forecast from the Fed was that they were going to continue to hike rates. They were supposed to have another 3 or 4 rate hikes in 2019. And of course, a year ago, as the Fed was hiking rates, they were still shrinking their balance sheet, and they were going to continue to shrink it. I mean, they were talking about autopilot. They were going to continue to do $50 billion a month of quantitative tightening. And they said this with a straight face. And everybody believed them. Of course, everybody except me, now maybe a few other people, but they weren't out there in the financial media. But I was telling anybody who would listen, which was not that many people in the mainstream, but certainly the people who listen to my podcasts, that none of this was going to happen. That the Fed was going to have to stop hiking rates and that they were going to be cutting rates in 2019. And that not only were they going to stop quantitative tightening, but they were going to go back to quantitative easing. And that's exactly where we are. Although Jerome Powell went out of his way, I think the first thing that he said when he made his statement, his prepared remarks, was to reassure everybody that what the Fed was doing now with its repo program was not quantitative easing, right? And he basically drew a distinction between what the Fed was doing when it was doing QE and what it's doing now when it's not doing QE. And the main distinction had to do with the maturities of the debt that the Fed was buying. That when they were doing QE, they were buying longer-term government bonds, but that now they're buying shorter-term government bonds, and so therefore it's not QE. But this is really a distinction without a difference. I mean, who cares what the maturities of the bonds are? Now, I suppose if the Fed was buying short-term bonds, and when the bonds matured, they weren't going to buy them again, right? They were going to let the market absorb those bonds, but that's not what they're going to do. They're just going to keep rolling these bonds over as soon as they mature, or not bonds, bills, with the shorter-term ones. Every 90 days, they're just going to buy them and buy them and buy them. And so this is another, source of financing of the Fed financing government debt. That's quantitative easing. Why did the Federal Reserve do QE in the first place? To keep interest rates lower than they would have been had they not done quantitative easing. And, by extension, to prop up asset prices, because had interest rates risen, which they would have done, or they certainly would have been higher without QE than they were with it, had interest rates gone up, that would have put downward pressure on stocks, on real estate, things like that. Well, why is the Fed doing what it's doing today? For the exact same reason. To keep interest rates artificially low, to suppress the cost of borrowing, to help out all debtors so they can make payments on their debt, and to keep the stock market elevated, to keep real estate prices elevated. In fact, one of the places that we've actually seen an improvement in the numbers, at least as they relate to the GDP, and we got those numbers earlier this morning before the Fed hiked rates. We got the Q3 GDP number, which came out at a positive 1.9. That was better than the 1.6 expected. It was a little bit below the 2% of the prior quarter. But that was despite weakness in investments. The main driver of the 1.9% was the consumer, and part of that was housing. Housing sales have picked up because of the help from the Fed. Now, I think it's a temporary boost. I think the market is still down, but the Fed was able to breathe life into a dying market temporarily with these rate cuts. So the Federal Reserve is basically doing now what it was doing then, for the same reasons it was doing it then, except it doesn't want to admit. Powell doesn't want to say that the Fed is doing quantitative easing.
Be right back.
And the main reason is because he doesn't want to admit that the economy needs it. I mean, one of the things he keeps reiterating is that the economy's in a good place, right? That everything is good. Well, if everything is good, why do we need the emergency monetary policy when everything wasn't good? When we were trying to get the economy out of a bad place, we did QE. And if it's now in a good place, well, why are we doing it again? So that's why he wants to deny he's doing it. In fact, earlier this morning, before we got the GDP number even, and well before the rate cut, Donald Trump tweeted out, the greatest U.S. economy in history. Greatest in history. Unqualified statement. The current economy is the greatest economy in all of American history. Now, of course, we know that is a BS statement, right? Just like, it's puffery, just like Trump claiming his steaks were the greatest steaks ever. He's now claiming that the U.S. economy is the greatest ever. And one of the reporters actually asked Powell to comment on that tweet. And Powell basically said, I'm not going to comment on anything that any politician says. Of course, Trump is not just any politician. He is the president of the United States. And I think the reporter should have re-asked the question. Instead of asking him to comment on what Trump said, just say, do you believe that the U.S. economy today is the strongest it's ever been in history? But he doesn't even have to answer that question because the answer is obvious. I mean, the Fed would not have cut interest rates if we had the greatest economy in the U.S. In fact, Powell was asked specifically by the reporters if he thought the current monetary policy was neutral or accommodating. And he admitted that it was accommodating. Now, it's obviously, it's naturally accommodating. I mean, you could argue it's the most accommodative it's ever been. Even more so maybe than when interest rates are at zero, because the inflation rate is higher. I mean, Powell admitted that core CPI is finally above 2%. But if inflation, even the core, the way the government measures it, is more than 2%, yet the Fed just dropped interest rates to 1.5%, you're talking about negative real interest rates of at least, let's say, 75 basis points. Negative interest rates. That is highly accommodating. I mean, why would the Fed be accommodating the strongest economy in the history of our country? Clearly, the reason that Powell thinks we need so much support from the Fed is because he knows the economy is weak. That without the Fed's help, it would implode. A strong economy doesn't need the help of the Fed. And in fact, Trump will admit himself, he says, hey, if I'm not reelected, the economy is going to implode. Well, if it was fundamentally strong, it wouldn't all hinge on his reelection. It wouldn't be so unstable that simply impeaching him, because even if he's impeached, I mean, there's still a Republican, right? Pence would be the president if Trump were impeached, but somehow that's going to implode this economy, yet it's the strongest economy ever, yet something as simple as changing from Trump to Pence is enough to cause the whole thing to come tumbling down. That, that shows that it's not strong. It's just a house of cards, and it's only a question of when the whole thing implodes.
Thanks.
But probably, the most significant thing about the rate cut was if you look at the way the media reacted to the initial announcement, because they put out the official press release that accompanies the quarter-point cut. And the Fed tweaked the language a little bit from the previous language that existed. And so based on this slight change, the interpretation was, hey, the Fed is finished cutting, right, with these three rates. And now it's kind of on a pause when the data ended, because the Fed is going to have to assess the incoming data and then determine its next move, right? That, okay, before that, we all knew that the Fed was going to keep cutting. But now that we've got these three cuts, in our pocket, whether or not we get a fourth cut and a fifth cut depends on the data. The Fed is going to look at the data and assess it and then determine where it wants to go. And so it's possible, right, that the Fed could hike rates. At least that was the initial read of this statement that, maybe the Fed is going to keep cutting. Maybe they're going to stay where they are. Maybe they're going to hike, right, depending on what the data is. And I think based on that, right, this was seen as a more hawkish stance or a less dovish position than the Fed had taken before. So initially, the dollar rallied a bit on that perception. Gold sold off a little bit on that perception. But when Powell had the press conference, he didn't waste any opportunity in walking that perception back and basically telling the nation where the Fed was. And basically what Powell said was that the Federal Reserve today has absolutely no intention of raising interest rates unless, right, there was a significant move up in inflation from its current level, and that move was persistent. Right now, Powell acknowledged that inflation is already over 2%, right? But that's not enough to cause the Fed to hike rates. In fact, the Fed is cutting rates in the face of inflation over 2% and rising. But what Powell is saying is, no. We need to see a really significant, I mean, he said really significant, not just significant, really significant move up in inflation that persisted before we would even consider raising rates. He didn't even say we would raise rates if we had a really significant, persistent increase in inflation. He said we need a really significant increase in persistent inflation before the Fed would even consider the possibility of raising rates. Now, they still might not do it, right? And of course, they're not going to do it because they can't do it. But this is a very, very dovish addition for Powell to make, because back in history, right, the old adage was never let the inflation genie out of the bottle, right?
Be right back.
And why was that? Because once the inflation genie is out of the bottle, it is very difficult to get that genie back into the bottle, right? Anybody who's ever watched I Dream a Genie knows how difficult it is to get a genie back into the bottle once she has escaped, right? And you can do all sorts of mischief before you can get her back in. And so the idea is, hey, keep the genie bottled up. Because if the inflation genie gets out, I mean, you know, look out. And so what that means is be vigilant, right? Be preemptive. Don't take a chance. But what is Powell saying? If inflation is already above 2%, and he's saying, no, I'm not even going to consider, the Fed's not going to even consider raising rates until we are significantly above where we are now, and it's persistent. So where is inflation going to have to get? I mean, 3%, 4%, 5%? And how long is it going to have to stay there before Powell and his buddies at the Fed even consider a rate hike? And of course, if they let the genie that far out of the bottle, right? It's not just letting Genie out, it's Genie and her twin sister. They're all out of the bottle, right? And maybe the blue gin too, right? All these genies out of the bottle. How are they ever going to hope to put the genie back in, right? The Fed is saying we're going to let the genie way out of the bottle before we even attempt to put it back in. I mean, why aren't the markets more concerned? The bond market, which actually rose today, the bond market should be getting killed. Where are the vigilantes when you have a Fed chairman admitting that there's no more vigilance, right? And in fact, every time Powell mentioned the word inflation, every single time in that press conference, it was prefaced by the word symmetrical. Symmetrical inflation. Symmetrical inflation. That's all he said. What does he mean again by symmetry? He means inflation that's above 2%. Because it's supposed to be symmetrical for all the years that it was supposedly below 2%. But, you know, nobody will ask him a question, right? I guess in order to be at the press conference, you have to agree, you know, just to throw softballs, and not to ask any real questions or to follow up. But I wish somebody would ask Powell explain exactly what he means by symmetrical, right? I mean, how high does inflation have to go before it's no longer symmetrical? And how long does it have to stay there, right? I mean, if he says that, well, inflation can go to 3% and still be symmetrical, what if it's at 3% for a year, right? 2 years. I mean, what is the time frame? I mean, how long can inflation stay above 2% before it's too long? Before the Fed has to do anything about it. But of course, if the Fed is so lax when it comes to inflation and letting the genie out of the bottle, when prior Fed chairmen were so worried about letting that genie out of the bottle, they wanted to be preemptive. Well, you know, why does Powell think he has so much ability, right? It's going to be so easy for him to do what prior Fed chairmen were worried about. In fact, the reality is it is going to be much harder for the current Fed to fight inflation and get the money back in the bottle than it was for any prior Fed chairman, including, of course, Paul Volcker, right, who really had to get the genie out of the bottle, right? I mean, there was no preemptive inflation fighting before Volcker took the job. And so when Volcker came in and he finally had to bottle up the inflation genie, interest rates had to go up to 20% in order to do that, right? The longer you wait, the further you get behind the inflation rate, the higher interest rates have to go to get out in front of it.
Thanks.
Well, if you have a lot of debt, then that cure delivers a lot more short-term pain. Now, we had a very bad recession in 81, 82 time frame because of those high interest rates. But can you imagine the severity of the recession we would have today if interest rates even rose to a meaningful fraction of that number, let alone all the way back up to 20%? So for an economy that is so susceptible to higher interest rates, the Fed should be extra vigilant now about inflation and trying to be preemptive because of how painful it would be to try to get in front of an accelerating inflation curve and put that genie back in the bottle, except the economy is already so over-leveraged, the debt bubble is already so big that we would have a massive crisis if the Fed did the right thing now. If the Fed's tried to stop inflation from running out of control now, like it should do, right? If it tried to fight early, we would have a crisis. Right? We would already be imploding. We'd already be in this great recession or a greater recession. So the Fed can't do anything. So that's why the Fed has to pretend that rising inflation is good. It has to pretend that it will fight inflation eventually, but not now, right? Because it can never actually do it. It can never even try to do it. The only key is, when is the market going to wake up to this game, this con? When are they going to realize the box that the Fed has put itself in, that it is completely impotent when it comes to inflation fighting, that it is all bark and no bite, and basically it's not even barking yet. It's only talking about the prospect of barking in the future, but it will never bite. And when the markets figure this out, the bottom is going to drop out of the dollar. Gold is going to absolutely go through the roof. Now, we also got some more economic data that came out today. We got the ADP employment report, the private sector jobs. Of course, we get the official government non-farm payroll report on Friday. The consensus for October was for a gain of 125,000 jobs, which would have been a little bit less than the 135,000 jobs reported for September. And we ended up with exactly 125,000 jobs, precisely what the consensus had forecast, but the revisions for the prior month brought the 135 all the way down to 93,000 jobs. Pretty big downward revision. We'll probably get, I guess, we'll have another downward revision to this number. Like, probably got a weaker number. But the most significant aspect of the number was the fact that the goods-producing sectors, including manufacturing, they all lost jobs, right? Manufacturing went down, other goods-producing jobs were lost during the month as we continue to add service-providing jobs, right? And this is the trend that we had all throughout the Obama presidency. We kept replacing, higher paying goods producing jobs with lower paying service providing jobs, many of them part-time. And we're doing the same thing now. And of course, when Trump was a candidate, he pointed this out. He was critical of the loss of manufacturing jobs and higher paying jobs. He promised to make America great again, in part by restoring these manufacturing jobs, by making American manufacturing great again. It was under that name that we were waging this trade war. Well, the reality is those trends have continued under Trump. We continue to lose goods-producing, higher-paying jobs and add service-providing, lower-paying jobs. Yet instead of criticizing it, he's now claiming it's the greatest economy ever. And of course, all of this is going to come back to bite Trump in the 2020 election. He was elected president because he told the truth about how lousy the economy was when everybody else was pretending it was great. The Democrats were pretending it was great. Wall Street, the media, was selling this line of this Obama recovery, which was phony. Well, now we have a phony Trump recovery, and instead of telling the truth about how weak the economy is, he's lying about how strong it is. And those lies are not going to resonate with the same voters who are going to be struggling in 2020 when they go to the polls and they have even more debt than they had when Trump was elected, right? They're in worse shape. In fact, one of the things that Powell specifically commented on in his press conference, he stated that he doesn't see any problems in the economy with debt or leverage, and that American households are in good shape. I mean, what is this guy talking about? I mean, do you have to be that blind in order to be Fed chairman? Do you have to be completely oblivious